A lot of video game goes into much of modern games. You go from solving puzzles to fighting baddies to platforming to racing vehicles to turret sequences, and you aren't switching out the disc, it's all just one game. There's a conversation to be had about the product of mechanic creep, games within games, and Gumbo game design. Now, that's not a very common term, but I find it's so widely applicable amongst games of today that I'm going to use it here. Gumbo game design, named after the grub, is when a game has many sequences or mini-games with distinctly different playstyles to mix up the moment-to-moment of a game and keep gameplay fresh. Different flavors add variety, the spice of life. For example, it's difficult to label one of the Arkham games into any singular genre, since there's so many different types of challenges. You're jumping between sneaking around armed goons and brawling with crowds of thugs with some small puzzles in between. It's a weird combo, but it actually works because being a crime-fighting ninja detective is what Batman is all about. However, these games run into a unique problem where players would love certain varieties of puzzles and hate others. It's not that any specific chunk of the experience was actually bad per se, but sometimes the player was forced to play one way when they wanted to play what was essentially an entirely different game. That bred resentment. Take for example the cinematic minigames and QTEs from Platinum Studios. If these moments were just cutscenes, they would lose half of their oomph, since the interactivity lets you feel the intensity of the situation. But since they're so brief, they become incredibly linear and invariable, so they lose almost all of their impact on repeat playthroughs. They go from some of the most spectacular highlights of the game to a chore the player would rather skip. Even the most charitable example I can think of, the wonderful 1-to-1's Punch-Out sequence, suffers from being arguably better than the rest of the game. Since this brief fight is so interesting, it makes the rest of the level a chore to slog through because you want to get to the fun part. On top of that, since it really only shows up twice, and since they're both at the end of a level, you don't really get much of an opportunity to practice, let alone master, either. Even if you could, you're learning a whole entire new set of mechanics that will never get fully fleshed out since they're just thrown away in a matter of minutes, and still need to teach first-time players the basics. If the player doesn't want to eat a certain piece of the gumbo, then suddenly, instead of something new and fresh, you've got an annoying interruption to an otherwise fun experience. Take for example Sonic Adventure 2. If a player only likes playing as Sonic, then suddenly 2/3 of the game becomes a chore to get to the good part. Even if the player kind of likes Knuckles or kind of likes Tails, any fun they would have had is sucked away since they know they'd rather be doing something else. In the player's mind, this new game within a game is competing with what they were just playing, and that's a no-win scenario for the experience as a whole. Unless the entire game is mechanically centered around the juxtaposition of the different play styles, then something's going to end up feeling more interesting than something else. The question becomes, how can a game within a game manage to balance fresh playstyles without interrupting the player when they're having fun? That's a difficult needle to thread, but I do know of a game that turns this problem into one of its primary mechanics very well. Rhythm Heaven Fever is a collection of very simple rhythm games which the player masters independently before challenging themselves to jump between multiple at a time in special remix levels. Not only does this sidestep the issue of interrupting you with its mission-based structure, but it also fully fleshes out each game since it uses them all over and over again. None of these moments come across as brief schizophrenic distractions, even if they're pretty nonsensical, since it all comes back around. Knowing all this, we can reverse engineer how to most effectively utilize Gumbo game design. First of all, if the gameplay of this new thing is not as fun as the last flavor, then that should be a red flag. If the developers create something that distracts from the core of their game, they aren't just wasting the player's time, but their own. In short, you don't need a hacking minigame for everything. You can just have a little animation. After that, if the game within a game is arguably more fun than the core loop, then there shouldn't be anything in the way of just playing that little minigame. If it's at the end of a level or in the middle of something else, then the player may not ever get to fully explore something they'd like to engage with. Next, there needs to be enough video game to actually play around with, and it needs to be fully fleshed out. An overly linear or invariable experience is too easily solved with a singular solution by even the least experienced of players, and such sequences leave players unsatisfied, uninterested, or wanting for more. Finally, once we have enough well-designed content, we need to synergize it with the other half of the game. The secret to satisfying Gumbo game design is to have each flavor of gameplay harmonize and flow into one another. Each game mode needs to be fully explored, and the intersections between each game mode need to be fully explored. Make a combat challenge easier if you open with stealth. Make stealth faster if you have an understanding of combat. Mechanic creep will always be a reality as long as creative devs have cash and time, but if these simple guidelines are followed, then their games can be just as quality as they are in quantity.